This is the Open University.
Hello, my darling listeners. I've been a tourist most of this year. I've been traveling in, Spain in January, then in France, in Germany, in Finland, in South Korea and in Japan. So I've been a tourist, but I really am a musician, and I keep this flat in Berlin to do my music. Essentially now to do my music, because I'm usually somewhere else. But unfortunately, just as happened 20 years ago when I lived in New York, some neighbors moved in. I mean, there was 9/11. That was one reason to leave New York. It was a bit scary after 9/11. But also some neighbors moved in who played techno music really loud right next to my apartment. And no matter how much we hammered on the door and asked them to turn it down, they wouldn't. And it would turn on like a light switch the moment they came into the flat and just stayed booming with the sound of the Roland 909 kick. And so this has happened here in Berlin. Unfortunately, a wine bar opened directly below my flat, which every evening plays this same. Apparently history hasn't moved on, musical history has not moved on, because they play the same boom, 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 Roland 909 kick drum type music. So if you hear any of that seeping into this explication of my new record, that's why. And it may be why I have to leave this apartment, because, you know, you can't live above that kind of toxic hedonism. Other people's music is the abyss, as I once put it. So I've been a tourist and now I'm being a musician, and I'm making a record called Krambambuli, which sounds a bit like Little Richard type Tutti Frutti, title. But it's actually based on this paperback book, Krambambuli, which I picked up somewhere, and I just like the typography on it. I love these old reclams, which are German didactic texts of classical literature. So I had this on my shelf in my kitchen. I see it when I'm doing the dishes, and that's a very creative moment for me, doing the dishes. So this is from the 19th century, early, I think the 1820s, Marie Ebner Eschenbach, who was an Austrian authoress, and it's the tale of a dog. This is a bunch of her short stories, but this particular one is about a dog with a divided loyalty between a poacher and a gamekeeper. And it's also a kind of juniper extract, cherry brandy liqueur type thing, much appreciated in Eastern Europe. And I just wanted a kind of, a crunchy word. I always like these crunchy words. See, I make my records really by appetite. The kind of thing that catches my ear is quite rare for music to really impress me. There'll be a moment, like there was one of these moments when I was in La Forêt Harajuku in Tokyo a month or so ago, and I suddenly, in a second-hand clothes shop, they started playing really loud the beginning of Depeche Mode's Never Let Me Down Again, which is not really a record I know very well, but it sounded really magnificent, that sort of synth-pop grandiosity. And it reminded me of AllMusic when I don't know if they still do this, I haven't looked at their site for a long time, but they used to put lists of adjectives for the kind of music you were making. And sometimes they would say that you were dramatic, theatrical, grandiose, words like that, adjectives which would connect you to other artists who had the same kind of grandiosity or theatricality or whatever. So obviously David Bowie, Dame David, has a particular theatricality. The Pet Shop Boys, I would get connected to all these people who I did genuinely appreciated, because they had this campy, queer but not necessarily gay quality to their music, which obviously appealed to me. And it could lead you to people like Alberto Camerini, the Italian, who would sort of make often baroque synth pop was what attracted me. Visage, John Fox, there's a lot of it around in the 80s, but I keep discovering or the productions of Haruomi Hosono when he worked with women singers, like Miharu Koshi, who made records called things like Boy Soprano, Parallelism, which I came to appreciate really in the early 21st century when I lived in Tokyo, and Japanese friends introduced me to Miharu Koshi. It could also, you could say Nico, Desert Shore, things like that. There's always a quality of doomy, self-dramatizing in this music which appeals to me. So I thought I'm going to do that. There was already a little bit of that on the 2 albums that I released last year, starting with Smudger and continuing with Isivu. There was a kind of queer theme in Isivu, and there's a kind of Benjamin Britten, Peter Pearce theme in Smudger. So it was very much about gay themes, weirdly enough. I'm straight, but I've always admired queer people or gay people from afar. There was kind of an 80s retro theme, and 1980 seems to be the key year for this album, actually, in terms of what I've been inspired by. So it's people like, I made some notes, actually, just about 10 lines of notes of what direction I wanted the album to take. And here is my notes list, my shopping list. Klaus Nomi, Megumi Satsu, Miharu Koshi, circa boy soprano and parallelism, Hosono mid-80s, Purcell, Hirono Nishiyama, who I met up with in Tokyo, actually. Magazine's Cutout Shapes, the theatricality of the second magazine album. Opera, Baroque opera, Antonin Artaud, particularly his kind of extemporized vocal performances when he was in asylums, when he was mad and people recorded him doing kind of poetry in this mad voice. And Shuta Hasunuma, who's a new Japanese artist that Cornelius told me he'd collaborated with, kind of jazz, funk. That one has not really led anywhere yet, but the Megumi Satsu particularly did, and this was how I discovered her about a year ago in Paris. I suddenly discovered this amazing Japanese torch singer called Megumi Satsu, who died in 2010. Her music was used in a Prada show in 2012. It was the Milan Spring-Summer Women's Collection for 2013. And her music was so torrid, sort of like electro-pop from the 80s. Rather frightening figure, but very striking. And I was really struck myself by the low numbers of views she gets on her YouTube videos. Not many people seem to know about her, either in Japan or in France. But she's a very interesting example of cultural fusion. So it was September 2021, and I just happened to see the Milan 2012 Spring-Summer Women's Wear collection from Prada, which had this remix of Megumi Satsu music in it. I'm not sure who the musical director was choosing that, but Megumi Satsu doesn't seem to have made much of a mark. You know, people like Mylène Farmer did hit big in France in the 80s with synth pop with a kind of melodramatic theatrical flair, enhanced in her case by her collaborator Laurent Boutonnat and his very cinematic, very Fellini-esque videos. But Megumi Satsu kind of really fell by the wayside, and still on YouTube her videos have very few views. And when I mentioned her name to people like Cornelius in Tokyo, nobody had heard of her. So I guess she left Japan in the late 70s, came to Paris, and inspired by a kind of French chanson, people like Jacques Prévert, she actually made an impression on Prévert just before he died. He asked his widow to give Megumi Satsu some of his material to interpret after his death. And she made some songs in collaboration with Topor, for instance, who's a Jewish French writer, and with a whole bunch of other people, Frédéric Mitterrand, the cousin of the president Mitterrand. But she had this frightening theatricality. So the first video I think I saw from her hat, she throws her hat off and shakes her kind of short hair free towards the end of the video. It's called Give Me Back My Soul. Has this very Baroque synth pop backing. And there's another great one called Je m'aime, I Love Myself, which has lyrics by Topor and is about masturbation, essentially. She loves herself. She doesn't need a lover to make love. The first track I made was called Murder Me, and it's very much me assuming the persona of Megumi Satsu. And what this allowed me to do, apart from having this theatrical quality, and also in a sense recapitulating the songs I would write for women like Amy Carey and The Poisoned Girlfriend in the 90s, that's something I feel I've neglected somehow, because it allowed me to find a female side of myself. I don't know what you'd call it, a masochistic side. Murder Me is very much a sexual metaphor. It's about the murder as a metaphor not just for sexual penetration, but also the abandonment of oneself to a willed destruction, the destruction of order and the destruction of the balance you make in your life to get by practically, throwing all that away. So it's a kind of Georges Bataille view of eroticism as a destructive force, but a gloriously destructive force. And so when you balance that kind of theme and that kind of presentation against the music of Purcell or Handel, which is very orderly and stately, this Baroque chord sequences which are super symmetrical, but also they can become very passionate when you put passions on top of them. And of course they come from a time when people lived much shorter lives and much harder lives. And the opera was really describing that, but also showing that passion was exciting. You needed to pack in some excitement into your short life. So in the video for Murder Me, I'm intercutting Megumi Satsu herself singing Give Me Back My Soul, which is based on, I think it's based on, is it Handel? Handel or Purcell? I think the chord sequences is taken from Baroque, directly from Baroque music. With intercutting that with commercials from Shiseido in the 80s, which is another of my sort of fetishes. I love the Shiseido, the aestheticism of those cosmetics and perfume commercials for products with weird names like Simon Pure, and which could have been a good album title as well. But it harks back to things like Charcoal from Pellicock, which is about destroy me. It says destroy me, you know, and it has this. It's more of a Renaissance kind of madrigal feeling in the music in that case, but it's about sex as destruction, or as something as a destructive force, which nevertheless you cannot resist. And also Cut Out Shapes by Magazine. I mean, you punched a hole in me. Maybe it's like that's a similar kind of scenario. So there's a weird kind of side to Howard Devota's writing, which is a sadism and a masochism combined, you know, in some of his lyrics, which I've always found interesting. You know, spooky and disturbing at the same time, but the disturbing things are the most interesting things to write about. I'm not going to write about how my life is orderly against orderly music. I want there to be some dynamic contrast. There has to be. It's the theatre of the self. So this eccentric voice, it's really quite like Sprechgesang, which is the German term for the kind of singing style which Schoenberg came up with when he made Pierrot Lunaire, which as a teenager, weirdly enough, I got really into. I went out and bought a copy of Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire, and it's all like Pierrot. As the German word says, speech, sing, Sprechgesang, it's speaking and singing alternately. So it allows you to inject and insert these actorish asides. In my case, that's what I did with it. You break the scansion and you break the rather predictable forms, the orderly forms of songwriting, verse, chorus, middle eight, whatever. You know, you can just put in a lot of extemporizations and actorish kind of asides and jokes and whatever, you know. So it allows the song to be a much bigger canvas, really. And Bowie actually did this on Heroes when he was recording songs like Joe the Lion. He would get Tony Visconti on the controls to just drop him in for each line as it came up, and he kind of improvised the lines. And I found myself in my last couple of albums doing this quite a bit. I think the first song I consciously did that on was Pesky Blighters, where I didn't know where the song was going to be. I had a backing track, and I didn't know where the melody was going to go and what was going to happen. It was quite irregular. I like making these very strange, awkward backing tracks that follow some sort of logic, but also have a lot of accidents in them, a lot of randomness. And that really creates something that exceeds the expectations of the listener, I find, or my own expectations as a composer, because you couldn't come up with that stuff. You need to be open to randomness and accident. So when songs like Blackout, you know, Hot Air Gets Me Into a Blackout, I'm under Japanese influence, my honor's at stake. All that stuff, it sounds like he's just reading from his notebook, or he's just making it up off the top of his head, or there's a persona which is powering that lyrical thrust. So I was doing really the same thing with Murder Me, and I had a list of lyrics, but I didn't know how I was going to sing them or which bits were going to go in and which weren't. It was just really the caprice of the moment, how this stuff fitted. But still constantly drawing on the Baroque in the chord sequence, chord structure. And that's really how this album has been unfolding. The next track I did for this album, Krambambuli, was called Dunderheads. And this was really just going directly to Handel. A song Handel wrote for, it's called Lascia Cio Pianga, and it's an aria in his opera Rinaldo, which was performed, in the version I listened to, it's performed by the Venice Baroque Orchestra, but it's Let Me Weep is the translation of that, and it was composed in 1711, specifically for the London stage, although it was in Italian. So I just pitch shifted a passage, the intro sequence of that, and made my own kind of arrangement around it, and then turned it into a song. And of course I've done this kind of thing before. The Artist Overwhelmed on Otto Spooky, 2004. It's sort of taking Gluck and Fuseli, the phrase "the artist overwhelmed by the grandeur of ancient ruins" comes from a painting by Fuseli. So it's the Romanticism movement, really. But classical music, you know. So I think I was really thinking about the Ukraine war, thinking about, you know, clumsy dunderheads. There's another world in which we're not stupid and we're not aggressive, and, you know, things go better, but maybe it's not this world, maybe it's another planet. There is hope, but not for us, as Kafka once put it. So there's a line: if duffers won't drown, if not duffers won't drown, if duffers won't matter, which is how I misremembered Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons, which I read when I was about 10 years old, and it's got this telegram sent by the father of the family to the children who want to know if they can be allowed to sail unsupervised. He says, "Better drowned than duffers, if not duffers won't drown." And I misremembered it as, "If not duffers won't drown, if duffers won't matter." So that's really kind of repurposed for climate change, you know, with rising sea levels and things like that. If we're duffers and we drown, it won't matter, you know. It's kind of a very jaundiced view, and it's probably the last song on the album. It's a kind of album ending, a last word kind of song. But when you use the idioms of one age to pass judgment on another, a time the first age could barely imagine, a time in the future, there's something a bit science fiction-y about it. So if you're using Baroque music to comment on the present, on the contemporary, it's not just retro, you're actually creating a zingy kind of contrast and a kind of science fiction scenario in which, you know, there is, and not just drawing on the original Baroque, but also on this 80s synth pop takes on Baroque. So it all gets kind of interesting and crunchy for me. I just love these kind of echoes and references, as you probably know if you know my music. It's also the sampling, Fuseli's the grandeur of ancient ruins also kind of, to me, makes me think about sampling, because we sample a lot, and we're making retro references a lot, as I am in this record. And this is us overwhelmed, our age overwhelmed by the grandeur of ancient ruins. I'm told there is a new Beatles single coming out. So it's not just sampling now, it's AI, because this new Beatles record used artificial intelligence to recreate John Lennon's voice, separate it from a demo and put it in a new backing. Some of the other Beatles, or the two remaining Beatles, have put together, so we're all expecting this. And we're seeing how AI, just as sampling did before it, is kind of giving us a new way for the present to relate to the past. The next track was Life After 60, which started with, I went to watch Klaus Nomi, the Cold song. Klaus Nomi is one of these artists, a bit like Megumi Satsu herself, who kind of promised more on paper than they delivered. There's a lot of kitsch and a lot of throwaway, you know, subpar material on Klaus Nomi's albums for RCA, for instance. But towards the end of his life, he got seriously into Baroque opera, and he did this very spooky reading of Purcell's The Cold Song. It's from King Arthur, the Purcell opera from 1691. And he performed it in a rough color, Klaus Nomi. He came on knowing he had AIDS, or nobody really knew. This was very early, I think it was 1981. Nobody really knew what AIDS was, but he had Kaposi sarcoma marks on his neck. So he wore this rough collar, partly to disguise the marks, but also to be in the Baroque period. He did this beautiful, it's one of the great readings of opera, of Baroque opera, saying, why have you called me back from the grave to come and look back at life one last time? And very presaging his own death, very, very moving. So I kind of started with that, but it's really just the tempo which remained in the end, because I made my own chord sequence, and it turned into Life After 60. But it does still relate to this theme of, mortality, and because in the 1600s, people didn't live very long, so death was constantly there in the background of all that music. You can hear it there. Even the music celebrating life and sex and joy is very much in the context. The dark backing of that mirror is death, and the fact that people didn't live very long in those days, and they dropped off at the age of 40, whatever it is, about the same age as Klaus Nomi was. So I'd hear these stories about Klaus Nomi, and of course I knew that he performed with Bowie in the Saturday Night Live kind of spoof thing where Bowie is spoofing his own theatrical impulses by saying, well, look, this guy takes it a lot further than I ever did. In Life After 60, I do a lot of this extemporization, again, the Megumi Satsu thing, where I become a character, but this time it's more like a kind of Rex Harrison, theatrical, crusty old dandy kind of character, or Quentin Crisp, or Bowie doing the Glass Spider narrative, So it's very camp, very Rada RSC kind of voice, actorish voice, that we're very familiar with because there's so many British actors who sound like that. And discussing, dating myself, but actually being myself. So it's kind of like Elaine Stritch doing I'm Still Here by Stephen Sondheim, a little bit that as well. Somebody left a comment under the video saying, cheer up, old man, it's not as bad as all that. But of course, it's a persona. I am post-60, but Life After 60 for me is not a dismal cabaret, as the song says. It's really more a song about the fun of making things and sort of acting out a dramatic scenario which relates to your fears and relates to ruminations you might have on speculations about what your future might be like. But so far it's great. It's just, being in my 60s is very much being like in my 30s. It's not radically different yet. So that turned out really well, I think, artistically. So I think the album will start with that one. The next one to be composed, though, was Theatre of the Self, which I think I went back to the Prada catwalk show and listened to the first Megumi Satsu song in that, which is called Je m'aime, the 1980 song she wrote with lyrics by Topor. Or she didn't write it, actually. Topor wrote the lyrics, and someone called Francis Dame wrote the music. Again, inspired very much by Baroque opera kind of arias and things. And she says, I don't need you to make love. And so I sort of played up the 80s kind of retro in there. I think it was originally done in 1980 for her debut album as a kind of orchestral piece, but then it was remade as a synth pop piece, which I much prefer. And it's got a kind of Mylène Farmer feel a little bit to it, but much more early 80s than that. So I turned it into a song about, rather than a song about masturbation, I have plenty of those already in my catalogue. I turned it into a song about self-mediation, which is, I suppose, just another form of masturbation, isn't it? But it's very much the thing I see around me everywhere. In Seoul, for instance, I would go to cafes where people were posing by a kind of swimming pool. There's always a focal point in Korean cafes, which is the Instagrammable point, the scenario. It's often a swimming pool or some kind of pink decor, or, a kind of dry ice rising from a pond in a hanok house or something like that, and then you'll see the influences. So it relates obviously to the song Influencer Village from the previous album, last year's album. But it's a more kind take. Influencer Village was just really playing up the absurdity of being an influencer. But this is really, because I was an early adopter of self-mediation. I was, I got fairly good at it at a time when people didn't have access to the technology. Recording studios amongst the technology, that you would use to self-mediate. to, as one person memorably put it, to broadcast my identity crisis to the world, which now everybody does, and everyone sort of supports it and roots for you when you do it. So I guess it's become generalized. But the song is thinking, can I really compete with these young influencers who know how to dramatize themselves, and they're constantly posing, and they're doing it very well, and self-mediating 24/7 with a 1-to-1 ratio of lived to shown experience. This is what I found when I was blogging, that I didn't go out. I was spending so much time as a keyboard warrior at home that I had very little actual material. It was like vomiting on an empty stomach, or as this song says, it's like being the Ouroboros, which is an ancient Egyptian and alchemical symbol, devouring its own tail, banqueting on tail. That's what happens when you have to mediate everything, when you feel the need to sell your experiences one by one as they happen. And it's a dangerous thing, and it's a negative. There are positive sides to it as well, because in theory it increases empathy and it entertains us and all the rest of it. But it can be very destructive too, and I see a lot of my favorite vloggers succumbing to the self-destructiveness of it. I was there, young man or young woman. You know, I know the risks of too much information, giving too much information. But I was always interested in things like Erving Goffman's, the sociology of this, Erving Goffman's 1957 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, for instance. He took a kind of dramaturgical analysis of how we present ourselves as kind of fictional characters on the stage of the street and in the stages of our own lives. So I've always found that very interesting. You don't have to be even self-mediating to be theatrical in the way you present yourself. And, it all makes life a richer tapestry, doesn't it? But there's a kind of, the alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros, there's a kind of alchemy, not just in, the Philosopher's Stone is supposedly making us live forever, and social media filters also make us young, youthful forever, because you can, with filters, you can make yourself look as young or as old as you want. But of course, everyone's going young rather than old. So there's some weird alchemy going on even now in this Ouroboros, devouring its own tail. And AI is about to, again, explode that and make it even more possible to self-mediate, to the extent that we'll all be in a completely unreal world, with the Apple headset and all the rest of it, which is a scary prospect. I like there to be a balance, a good balance between the theatricality of self-mediation and some kind of reality and groundedness. The final song in this sequence, the first 5, and I have to do these videos as I make the songs because they allow me to, remember what I was thinking about when I made the song, but also to sort of develop the themes further and go in new directions. Men Are the Problem is today's song that I published today. And I've always loved morale-boosting, wholesome songs that I can undermine with nihilism or with doubt or with communism or whatever it is, anarchy. So for instance, Breathless on Time Lord is a kind of endless qualification, a whole string of provisos about the troubles ahead for a love relationship. But then it's like, there's a but. The one consolation is that there are clouds at the end of the rainbow, which is a very Brechtian thing. It's like the end of the Threepenny Opera, where it says, for love will endure or not endure, regardless of where we are, which sounds like a very gung-ho optimism. But actually, if you think about it, well, it will endure or it won't endure here or in some other place. There's like a endless kind of receding certainty in that. And I've always liked that it sounds like it's very positive. So I actually stumbled across one of these very show-busy positivity kind of songs. It wasn't Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, which ends the life of Brian, which is already a parody of that kind of song. It was actually, in 1980, Debbie Harry appeared with Kermit the Frog doing a duet of a song called The Rainbow Connection, which was in 1979, it was in the Muppet movie. It was written by Paul Williams and Kenneth Asher. And it was inspired by When You Wish Upon a Star from the Disney movie Pinocchio. And then the Carpenter, then it was on the Muppet album, and it was on the Muppet Show with Debbie Harry doing it as a kind of reprise of the Muppet album. And that's very charming when Debbie Harry duets with Kermit. And it's a kind of weird song, and it had it's got a real kind of waltz time swing to it. So I really liked the video, and then apparently the Carpenters did their own version of it. Karen Carpenter recorded a demo for it for their 1981 album Made in America, but Karen hated the song, and so it wasn't remade until the 21st century after she was dead. I mean, she vetoed it appearing on the album. But then the remaining Carpenters remade it with a beautiful, but very kitschy, but very them arrangement. So I started off with the idea of making a jaundiced version of the Rainbow Connection. So then it turned into, I don't know where the idea of men are the problem came from. Obviously, I've been imbued very deeply since my 20s with the idea of the new man, what we called the new man in the 80s, which then turned into this horrible, it flipped over in the 90s to the new lad, where all the kind of atavistic impulses of men came back. And then there was this book, Iron John, which is about rediscovering masculinity and the value of masculinity. But I really rejected, I was on the feminist bandwagon in the 80s and rejecting the idea of a conventional masculinity. So men are the problem is a very familiar idea for me. And as a man, I'm troubled by a lot of things in my manhood, my maleness, and the things especially I see in the untrammeled maleness of people, especially people in power like Putin or whatever. Putin is the example of toxic masculinity, I guess. I suppose the current war giving me this negative view of masculinity. Of course, men have done wonderful things. Somebody on Facebook compared it to, said, there'll be an AI reading of this sung by Valerie Solanas. But Valerie Solanas never realized what my song realizes in the last verse, which is that wanting to kill men or be rid of men is itself the cardinal sin of men anyway. And this is where the spiral of violence begins. So you can't be rid of anyone. Valerie Solanas' solution, shooting Andy Warhol, was not the correct solution. And I've spent most of my life with women by choice. I don't really relate very well to men. I didn't have a great relationship with my father. So in that sense, I'm kind of like a gay man, I think, in the sense that I kind of want to do women, to do femaleness as well as maleness. A lot of my clothes here are actually female clothes. The shirt I'm wearing, I cut down the collar on this shirt because it had like a long trailing collar that would go over your breasts if you had breasts. But most of my shirts are actually female shirts. I love female clothes. They smell better, they look better, they have more colours and more interesting shapes and different shapes and things. So that's where we are. Thank you for indulging me, and thank you for the very positive responses to this record. It's great when work resonates. And so this sort of theatricality, a lot of people are saying come and do this live because this is going to work very well on stage. Of course it will, because it's very theatrical, and I love to sort of prance about and throw shapes on stage. So I hope I'll be returning to live work eventually. I do have offers which I need to get back to people about the offers to do this stuff live. I have these terrible dreams though when I have concerts coming up that I'm going to forget my lyrics, and so there'll be technical problems and it'll sound terrible and people will drift away, and as it says in the Life After 60 song, my friends back away politely, applauding. There we are. I'm going to keep working, and I hope it's all going to be on the level and on the standard which so far it seems to be at. And see you next time.
Open University.